7 years of my life, my reputation, my stability, all of it was built on a foundation of solid, undeniable facts. I never imagined that everything I had worked for could be threatened and possibly destroyed by a single predatory smile. My name is Leo Vance. For most of my 41 years, I have been a man who believes in order, in spreadsheets, and in the predictable, comforting logic of numbers. As a senior logistics analyst for Apex Distribution Incorporated in downtown Toronto, that belief wasn't just a philosophy. It was my profession. It was the bedrock that supported my life, especially my weekend visits with my daughter, Sophie. After my divorce 3 years prior, the steady, reliable rhythm of my 9 to 5, the morning coffee from Tim Hortons, the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, that was my world. It was safe. It was secure. That security began to crumble the day Isabelle Moreau was appointed our new vice president of business strategy. At 38, she was sharp, ambitious, and moved through the office with the confidence of a conqueror. On her first tour, she paused at my cubicle, her gaze lingering. Her eyes flicked down to my nameplate. "Leo Vance," she said, her voice a smooth purr that felt out of place amongst the drone of keyboards. "I read your file. You're the wizard behind the curtain, the numbers guy." I offered a polite, professional nod. "I focus on keeping things running efficiently, Miss Moreau." "I'm sure you do," she replied, a knowing smile touching her lips. She placed a hand on my shoulder, letting it rest a moment too long. A subtle but distinct breach of professional boundaries. Intense focus is a very valuable trait. She moved on, leaving me with the faint scent of expensive perfume and a knot of unease I couldn't explain. A week later, in a team meeting, her praise for my quarterly report was so effusive, it felt like a performance. "Brilliant, Leo, simply brilliant," she announced, putting me in a spotlight I didn't want. I saw my colleague, Mark Chen, study the conference table with sudden intensity. I wasn't feeling appreciated. I was feeling singled out. The true test, however, arrived late on a Friday afternoon. The office was quiet as an email from Isabelle landed in my inbox. The subject, strategy session. She wanted to do a deep dive on logistics strategy, but she found the office stifling. Instead, she had booked a table for two at Scaramouche, one of Toronto's most expensive and romantic restaurants, for Tuesday evening. I read the email 3 times. This wasn't a business meeting. It was a summons disguised in corporate jargon. I stared at the invitation on my screen. This wasn't about strategy. This was a test, and I had a sinking feeling that there was no right answer. There are moments in your career that define you. My moment of definition came not in a boardroom, but in the cold, silent refusal to play a game I never asked to join. I spent the entire weekend composing and deleting drafts of my response to Isabelle's email. Each version felt wrong, too confrontational, too compliant, too weak. I remembered a story about Frank from accounting, a guy who'd had a public disagreement with a senior VP a year ago. 2 weeks later, his position was suddenly made redundant during a minor restructuring. The message was clear. At Apex, you did not cross the people in the corner offices, but the alternative was unthinkable. On Monday morning, I walked to her office, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. Her office was a testament to power, a vast expanse of polished mahogany and chrome, with a floor-to-ceiling window, offering a panoramic view of the CN Tower and the glittering expanse of Lake Ontario. She gestured for me to sit, her smile as bright and hard as the city skyline behind her. "Leo," she began, leaning back in her leather throne, "I'm so looking forward to our dinner." "Actually, Miss Moreau," I said, keeping my voice steady, "I appreciate the invitation, but I think a formal meeting here at the office during business hours would be more productive for a strategy session." Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she said smoothly, "but my offer was about more than just one meeting. I see a great deal of potential in you, Leo. I've been thinking of creating a new role, a special assistant to the VP, someone to be my right hand, to handle sensitive projects, to be completely aligned with my strategic vision. It would come with a significant pay increase, of course, and other duties. It requires discretion, total loyalty. You understand what I mean, don't you? The corporate doublespeak was a thin veil over a crude proposition. This was it, the precipice. I'm honored you see potential in my work, I said, choosing my words with the care of a bomb disposal expert. But my skills and my focus are in logistics analysis. I believe that's where I provide the most value to Apex. So I'll have to respectfully decline. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. The mask of the charismatic executive fell away completely, revealing the raw, entitled fury beneath. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am here to do my job," I stated, my voice quiet but firm. "Not for whatever this is." She stared at me for a long moment, her expression a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "I see," she said slowly, standing up and smoothing the front of her expensive dress. "Well, Leo, perhaps you should think very carefully about your priorities. This company values team players, ambitious people who understand how business really works. This is a career-limiting decision you're making." As I stood to leave, she added one final, chilling remark. "Real men know how to seize their opportunities." Less than 2 hours later, the consequences arrived. I was deep in a freight analysis when Sarah Jenkins from Human Resources appeared at my cubicle, flanked by a uniformed security guard. Sarah, a woman I'd always had pleasant conversations with in the break room, wouldn't meet my eyes. She wrung her hands as she passed me a white envelope. The letter was brutally concise. My employment with Apex Distribution Incorporated was terminated for cause, effective immediately, due to insubordination and a failure to align with corporate values. I was to gather my personal belongings and be escorted from the premises. I looked up and saw my colleague, Mark Chen, staring intently at his screen, refusing to acknowledge the scene unfolding just a few feet away from him. The walk through the office was the most humiliating experience of my life. The whispers, the averted gazes, the silent judgment. As the security guard led me through the expansive lobby, I saw her. Isabel was standing near the elevator bank, chatting with another executive. She turned her head as if sensing my presence, and our eyes met. She gave me a small, triumphant smile, a final, silent punctuation mark on her act of vengeance. Driving away from the building that had been my professional home for 7 years, the shock began to fade, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She thought she had destroyed me. She had no idea she'd just started a war. In the silence of my empty apartment, surrounded by the remnants of a life she'd shattered, I made a choice. I would not be a victim. I would be a case study. The first 48 hours were a blur of shock and fury. Her triumphant smile was seared into my memory, a symbol of the absolute power she wielded. How could 7 years of dedicated work be erased in less than 2 hours? By Saturday, the raw anger began to cool and harden into something else. Purpose. I was a logistics analyst. My entire career was built on gathering data, finding patterns, and executing a plan. I would approach this the same way. My dining room table in my Mississauga apartment became my new workstation. I laid out the evidence. There was the printed email exchange about the dinner meeting at Scaramouche. There were the screenshots of text messages she'd sent after 10 o'clock at night, ostensibly about work, but laced with unsettlingly personal undertones. Then, as I scrolled through my phone's files, I found something I had completely forgotten about. A voice memo, recorded 3 weeks ago, during a one-on-one meeting, where her tone had made me so uncomfortable. I discreetly hit record. I pressed play. My own voice was calm, discussing shipping projections. Hers was syrupy, unprofessional, but a real partnership. "Leo," her voice said from the tiny speaker, "requires a deeper level of understanding, knowing what the other person truly needs to feel motivated." It was circumstantial, but it was a start. It was a pattern, but I knew instinctively it wasn't enough. It was my word against a vice president's. My last hope for an internal ally was Mark Chen. I called him on Sunday morning. His voice was strained, guarded. "Leo, man, I'm sorry about what happened, but I really can't talk about it," he stammered when I asked if he'd noticed Isabel's behavior. "You know, company policy. Maybe it's best to just move on. He hung up before I could reply. That was it. She hadn't just fired me. She had poisoned the well, turning my colleagues into fearful strangers. I was utterly alone. And that's when I knew I couldn't do this by myself. On Monday, I found myself sitting in a booth at a Tim Hortons, a plain manila folder on the table in front of me. Across from me sat Victor Novak, a private investigator. He was a former Toronto police detective in his mid-50s, with a calm, patient demeanor that suggested he'd seen every flavor of human betrayal. He looked more like a history teacher than a PI. I laid out my story, my voice even and methodical as I presented the emails, the texts, the voice memo. He listened without interruption, sipping his black coffee. When I finished, he nodded slowly. She built a paper trail on you beforehand, he said, his voice matter-of-fact. Fabricated complaints, negative performance notes. By the time she makes her move, Human Resources has a folder thick enough to justify the termination. It's the corporate playbook. He quoted me a fee for a preliminary investigation, a number that made the air leave my lungs. It was a huge chunk of my savings. But as I looked at Victor's steady, knowing eyes, I knew it was the only way forward. I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and sent the retainer. There was no turning back now. A week later, my phone rang. It was Victor. "I've got something," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. I dug into Isabel Moreau's employment history. You were right to be suspicious. Before Apex, she was at a tech firm in Montreal for 2 years. Before that, a manufacturing company in Kitchener. He paused. At both companies, her rapid promotion coincided with the sudden departure of promising male employees, all terminated for performance issues. You're not the first, Mr. Vance. Not even close. She's left a trail. Suddenly, the weight of my own misfortune felt lighter, replaced by the crushing gravity of a dozen questions. Who were they? Where were they? And could I convince them to fight alongside me? A predator is strongest when their prey is isolated. My mission was no longer just about revenge. It was about building a wolf pack. Victor's revelation that I was not the first victim changed everything. My solitary quest for justice now had the potential to become a crusade. But Victor's list of names was also a list of men who were likely broken, terrified, and possibly bound by non-disclosure agreements. Convincing them to dredge up the worst experience of their professional lives would not be easy. The first name on the list was Daniel Lee. According to Victor's research, he had been a promising project manager at a tech firm in Montreal before Isabel Moreau's tenure there. He was let go for poor team fit and failure to meet project deadlines 6 months after she was promoted to his director. My hand hesitated over the phone. I was about to call a complete stranger and ask him to reopen a wound he had likely spent years trying to close. I took a deep breath and dialed. A man's guarded voice answered on the third ring. "Hello, Mr. Lee. My name is Leo Vance," I began, my voice steady. "You don't know me, but I believe we have a former boss in common, Isabel Moreau." The silence on the other end was heavy with hostility. "Who gave you this number?" he finally snapped. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was recently terminated from Apex Distribution," I continued calmly, ignoring his denial. "She told me I was making a career-limiting decision after I declined a personal offer. Does that sound familiar?" There was another long pause, but this time, the hostility was replaced by a sharp intake of breath. "Where are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "We met the next day at a second cup, halfway between my place and his." Daniel was a man who looked older than his years, with tired eyes that darted around the coffee shop, as if he expected Isabel to walk in at any moment. As we compared our stories, the details were so chillingly similar. It was like reading from the same script. The initial inappropriate praise, the unprofessional invitations, the veiled threats, the fabricated performance issues. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't just talking to a potential ally. I was talking to someone who truly understood. Seeing the resolve in my eyes, something shifted in him. "She made me sign an NDA, he said, his voice laced with years of resentment. "Got a pittance for severance. in exchange for my silence. But the agreement was about my termination. It didn't say anything about things I might have saved before I was fired. He reached into his briefcase and slid a small silver USB drive across the table. She was careless back then. This has everything. Emails she sent me, project notes she doctored after the fact to make me look incompetent. I can't be part of a lawsuit, but I can't stop you from finding what's on this drive. The USB felt heavy in my hand, a totem of hope. That evening, Victor and I spoke on a secure line. The contents of the drive were even better than we'd hoped. It was the proof we needed. This makes our case 10 times stronger, Victor said. It's time to contact the next name on our list, James Foster. The call with James was different. When I told him I had corroborating evidence from another victim, the fear in his voice was replaced by anger. She ruined my reputation, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I'll do it. I'll go on the record. We had it. A named source, an anonymous corroborating source, and documentary proof. A lawsuit was an option, but it would be a war of attrition, draining our limited funds for years. Isabel and Apex would bury us in legal fees. We needed a different weapon. We needed to make the cost of protecting her higher than the cost of exposing her. We needed a public square execution. I spent the rest of the night researching. I needed one of the best investigative journalists in the country, someone who specialized in corporate malfeasance and wasn't afraid of a fight. I found an expose on wage theft in the Toronto Chronicle, written by a reporter named Chloe Tremblay. Her writing was sharp, relentless, and meticulously documented. She was the one. My heart pounded as I dialed her number, my pitch rehearsed in my mind. Miss Tremblay, I said when she answered. I have a story about a serial corporate predator, currently working as a VP at a major Toronto company. I have multiple victims, one willing to go on record, and documentary evidence. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind that feels like an eternity. Then Chloe's voice, sharp and clear. Mr. Vance, how soon can you and your sources meet me? For months, Isabel Moreau operated in the shadows. We were about to give her the biggest spotlight in the city. Our meeting with Chloe Tremblay was intense. She was sharp, empathetic, but relentlessly professional. She cross-referenced our stories, examined the evidence on the USB drive, and made secure calls to verify details. At the end of the 2-hour meeting, she looked at James and me, her expression grim. I believe you. This is a powerful story, and we're going to publish it, she said. But you need to be prepared. They will come after you. They will dig into your lives, call you disgruntled employees, liars. They will try to destroy your credibility to save their own. Are you ready for that? I thought about my daughter, Sophie. I thought about the man I saw in the mirror, the one Isabel had tried to break. Let them try, I said. The following week was the longest of my life. I barely ate. I barely slept. My apartment, once my sanctuary, had become a command center, where the only thing I did was refresh my screen, waiting. Then, on Tuesday morning, it happened. The front page of the Toronto Chronicle's website was dominated by a single headline: The Predator in the Corner Office. How a rising Toronto executive at Apex Distribution preys on her staff. My hands were shaking as I clicked the link. Chloe had laid out the story with devastating precision. It started with James Foster's on-the-record account, his name and face there for the world to see. It was supported by the documented evidence from the USB drive and corroborated by an anonymous source, Daniel, and my own recent experience. By noon, the story had gone viral. The hashtag Apex Predator was the #1 trend in Canada. I watched on social media as a firestorm of outrage erupted. Comments poured in by the thousands. This is horrifying. Apex needs to be held accountable. I'll never use their services again. It was terrifying and vindicating all at once. Wednesday brought the second article, A Pattern of Silence: How Apex and Other Corporations Bury Harassment Claims to Protect Executives. This piece was a masterclass in investigative journalism, detailing the use of non-disclosure agreements, fabricated performance reviews, and the corporate culture that enabled predators like Isabel. By mid-afternoon, Apex Distribution's stock had dropped 12%. The company finally issued a pathetic, jargon-filled statement about taking these allegations very seriously and launching a comprehensive internal review. That afternoon, Isabel Moreau's polished LinkedIn profile vanished from the internet. She was in retreat. On Thursday, the pressure became too much. A formal statement announced that Isabel had been placed on indefinite administrative leave, pending the results of the investigation. It was a major victory, but it wasn't the end. The final blow came on Friday, with Chloe's third article, breaking the silence. More victims speak out about workplace harassment. It featured 2 more anonymous accounts from men Victor had uncovered, men who felt brave enough to speak after seeing the public support. Isabel was no longer just an executive accused of wrongdoing. She was a serial predator, exposed for all to see. The weekend was a tense, agonizing silence. The war had been fought. The bombs dropped. Now, we waited for the final surrender. It came on Sunday afternoon, not with a bang, but with a quiet buzz from my phone. It was a text from Chloe. It contained only a link. I clicked it. The link led to an official press release from Apex Distribution Incorporated. The headline was cold, concise, and beautiful. Apex Distribution Inc. terminates VP Isabel Moreau for violations of corporate conduct policies. I read the headline 3 times, letting the words sink in. We had won, but as I stared at the cold, corporate text, a new question emerged. After a victory that cost you everything, what comes next? They say the best revenge is living well. I discovered that the best revenge is rebuilding a life that is untouchable by the people who tried to tear it down. The question of what comes next lingered in the air for 3 weeks. My apartment in Mississauga, once a prison of anxiety, slowly became a place of peace again. I updated my resume, uncertain of what my future held. I had won the battle, but Isabel's smear campaign had left a public scar. I worried that I had become unemployable, a pariah in the logistics industry. Then, one Tuesday, I received a call from a number with a Calgary area code. It was the head of human resources for Summit Logistics, a major competitor to Apex. Mr. Vance, the man said, his voice warm and professional. My colleagues and I have been following the story in the Chronicle. It took incredible courage to do what you did. We value that kind of integrity. He paused. We also happen to need a senior manager for our Western distribution hub, and your resume is impressive. We need someone with your attention to detail and your ethical compass. The offer he made me left me speechless. A salary 40% higher than what I had been making at Apex, a better title, and a contract that included comprehensive whistleblower safeguards. I accepted on the spot. On my last weekend in Ontario, I drove to pick up Sophie for our father-daughter day. She ran out to the car, her gap-toothed grin lighting up my world. Dad, Mom said, "You got a new job in the city with the Cowboys," she exclaimed as she buckled herself in. "That's right, sweetheart," I said, my heart swelling. "It's a good one." We spent that afternoon at the Science Museum, looking at dinosaur skeletons and exhibits about space. It was a day of normal, simple things. The kind of moments that had felt a world away just a few months ago. Watching her laugh, her face illuminated by the glow of a planetarium display. I knew with absolute certainty that every agonizing step of the fight had been worthwhile. This was what I was protecting. This was the life Isabel Moreau could never touch. Months later, I was settled. My new office in Calgary had a view of the distant Rocky Mountains, a daily reminder of solid, unshakable strength. I was respected by my team, valued by my superior, and I was excelling at my work. One evening, as I was packing up to go home, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It read simply, "Thank you. I read your story. You gave me the courage to finally speak up about my own situation. You'll never know how much you helped." I stared at the message, a wave of profound emotion washing over me. Isabel's firing had been justice, but this was victory. The real victory wasn't in her downfall, but in the ripple effect of our actions. It was in the anonymous person who now felt safe. In the future, victims who might now be spared, because a predator's pattern had been brought into the light. Some battles are fought not for what you can win, but for what you refuse to lose. And in the quiet hum of my new life, I knew I had refused to lose the most important thing of all, myself. Thank you for joining me on this journey. It's a powerful reminder of how it feels to have your life upended by an abuse of power, but also how empowering it is to see justice served. This story is just one, but I know many of you may have faced similar battles in silence, feeling like you were completely alone. The greatest lesson here is that in the face of injustice, patience and strategy are your sharpest weapons. While emotions run high, clear documentation and a well-thought-out plan are what ultimately win the war. This story also proves that while a predator is strong against an isolated target, they are powerless against a united front. Never underestimate the strength you can find when you stand together. Thank you for listening and for being a part of this community. We believe in the power of sharing these narratives to learn from and support one another. If this calculated revenge story resonates with you, please leave a 1 in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our next story. And if you have your own story that you feel comfortable sharing, we'd love to hear it.